Children should be seen and not heard. If you're a certain age, you didn't just hear that phrase growing up. You were raised inside it, as an actual operating rule, not a joke people say ironically anymore. And now, decades later, you may be watching your own adult child parent, or even just talk to you, as if you're supposed to be equals, as if your opinion, your authority, your role as the parent carries no more automatic weight than theirs does as the child. If that whiplash has ever left you speechless, wondering how the entire rule book changed without anyone actually handing you the new one, I want you to stay for this next few minutes, because I'm going to walk you through exactly how that rule book changed, who changed it, and this is the part that actually matters. Why understanding the mechanism might finally make this hurt a little less like a personal rejection and a little more like what it actually is. 100 years of parenting philosophy compressed into roughly one generation's worth of lived experience. I want to start with something you may not know, because I didn't either until I went looking into this properly. The obedience model of parenting that so many people over a certain age were raised inside wasn't some ancient, timeless tradition. It was, in a very real sense, a specific, deliberately designed philosophy, with an actual author and an actual publication date. In 1928, an American psychologist named John Watson, one of the founders of the entire field of behaviorism, published a book called Psychological Care of Infant and Child. And what Watson recommended, in explicit, confident, scientific-sounding language, reads almost shocking today. He advised parents to treat children the way you'd train an efficient adult employee. Never hug and kiss them, never let them sit on your lap, shake their hand in the morning instead. Watson believed affection created what he called invalidism, weak, overly dependent adults, and that the path to a strong, capable child ran through consistent discipline, minimal physical comfort, and treating a child's emotional expressions as something to be trained out of them rather than responded to. This wasn't a fringe idea. Watson's book was enormously influential, and its underlying philosophy: obedience over emotional attunement, discipline over comfort, a clear and largely unquestioned hierarchy between parent and child, shaped an entire generation of parenting advice across the following decades, including how many of your own parents or grandparents were raised, and in turn how they raised their own children. Then, in 1946, something shifted, and it shifted through one specific book that I think deserves much more credit for the world we live in now than it usually gets. Dr. Benjamin Spock published the Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, and it opens with a line that, at the time, was genuinely radical: "Trust yourself. You know more than you think you do." Spock's entire framework pushed back directly against Watson's behaviorist coldness. He told parents that their child's emotional needs were real, that affection wouldn't spoil a child, that responding to a baby's cries with comfort rather than a schedule wasn't weakness. It was good parenting. Spock's book went on to sell tens of millions of copies and became, for decades, the single most influential parenting book in America. I want you to sit with the scale of that shift for a second, because I think it's the actual origin point of the whiplash so many families are living through right now. In less than 20 years, the dominant, expert-endorsed philosophy of how to raise a child swung from affection creates weakness to trust your instincts and respond to your child's feelings. An almost complete reversal, and it happened fast enough that people who were raised under one model became parents expected to operate, at least partially, under the other. But here's the part I think gets missed in most conversations about this shift. Spock's revolution was about emotional warmth, not really about authority. Parents in the Spock era were encouraged to be warmer, more responsive, less physically punitive. But the underlying hierarchy, parent above child, obedience still expected, even if delivered more gently, largely stayed intact. This is where a psychologist named Diana Baumrind, whose research we discussed in our last episode, becomes so important again, because her work in the 1960s and 70s was essentially trying to map exactly this middle ground. A parenting style she called authoritative, combining real warmth with real, still intact structure and expectation. Baumrind's framework was, in some sense, an attempt to hold on to Spock's warmth without losing Watson's structure entirely. So if that's the world, many parents watching this were actually raised inside, warmer than Watson's cold obedience model, but still built around a clear hierarchy, still built around the basic premise that a parent's authority carried more automatic weight than a child's preference. What changed next? Because something clearly did. And I think it's the piece of this puzzle most people never got a clear explanation for. I want to bring in a very different kind of voice here, someone whose work I think explains the emotional, rather than just the behavioral, side of this next shift. Alice Miller, a Swiss psychoanalyst writing in the late 1970s and 80s, published a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child, and later work that named something she called poisonous pedagogy, a term she used to describe parenting traditions, including many that looked warm and well-intentioned on the surface, that were still fundamentally organized around the child meeting the parent's emotional needs rather than the reverse. Miller argued that even affectionate, Spock-era parenting could still carry hidden expectations of obedience, gratitude, and emotional labor flowing from child to parent. A child who has to manage a parent's moods, earn love through good behavior, or suppress their own authentic feelings in order to keep the relationship stable. Miller's work became enormously influential in psychotherapy circles, and I think it planted a seed that eventually grew into something much bigger than she could have anticipated. An entire cultural conversation, decades later, about examining even well-meaning parenting for hidden hierarchies, hidden control, hidden conditions attached to love. The exact themes we spent our last episode exploring through Erich Fromm's work. Once that seed took root, the next generation of parents, many of them now raising children of their own, began asking a question that simply wasn't part of the Watson or even the Spock framework. Does my child owe me obedience, or does my child owe me nothing except honesty? And do I, in turn, owe them the same respect I'd extend to any other person I love? That question, sincerely asked, not asked to be provocative, is, I think, the actual philosophical engine behind what we now sometimes call gentle parenting, or more broadly, the shift toward treating children as full people with legitimate autonomy from a much earlier age than any previous era assumed. And I want to be precise about something here, because I think it matters. This shift isn't simply younger generations being softer, or more permissive, or less disciplined, the way it sometimes gets dismissed by people who lived through an earlier model. It's the direct philosophical descendant of Alice Miller's critique, an attempt to remove the last hidden layer of hierarchy that even Spock and Baumrind's warmer models still preserved. Here's where I think we finally arrive at the actual hurt this episode's title is naming, because I don't want to just walk you through history without landing on why it lands so hard emotionally for so many parents right now. If you were raised, even partially, inside a hierarchy-based model, where a parent's authority carried automatic weight, where because I said so was a complete sentence, where respect flowed upward by default rather than being continuously earned in both directions, and your own adult child was raised, or has since adopted, a model built on the opposite premise, that respect is earned reciprocally, and hierarchy itself is something to be justified rather than assumed, then almost every interaction between you is quietly running on two incompatible operating systems, the same way we described in our episode on loyalty and freedom. When your adult child treats you as an equal rather than an authority, questioning your advice the way they'd question a friend's, expecting you to apologize the way you'd expect an apology from anyone else, expecting negotiation rather than deference, it can genuinely feel, from inside the hierarchy model you were raised in, like a loss of something that should have been automatic. Not because your child is being disrespectful, because the entire framework they're operating inside doesn't include automatic respect based on role as a category that makes sense to them at all. They're not withholding something you're owed. They're operating inside a philosophy where that category was never installed in the first place. I think this reframe genuinely matters, because so much of the pain in these interactions gets interpreted as personal. My child doesn't respect me, when the more accurate description is closer to, my child and I are running two different, historically specific operating systems for what a family relationship even is, and neither of us installed our own system. We each inherited it, the way you inherit a language, before we were old enough to evaluate any alternative. I want to bring one more piece of evidence into this, because I think it helps explain why this particular generational transition feels so much more dramatic than earlier ones. Psychologist Twenge's large-scale generational data, which we referenced in an earlier episode, shows this shift accelerating specifically in recent decades. Individualism, personal autonomy, and psychological authenticity rising as core values at a faster rate than in previous generational transitions. Which suggests something important. This isn't simply every generation thinks the next one is too soft, a complaint that's existed forever. The data suggests the actual philosophical distance between the obedience-adjacent models many older parents were raised inside and the equals-based models many younger adults now operate inside is unusually wide, compressed into an unusually short amount of time. Watson to Spock, to Baumrind to Miller, to the fully autonomy-centered model of today in less than a single century, with most of that final acceleration happening inside the last 30 or 40 years alone. So what do you actually do with this, now that you can see the shape of it? I don't think the answer is abandoning everything about the framework you were raised inside. A lot of what came out of the obedience-adjacent tradition included real wisdom about structure, consistency, and boundaries that don't simply become worthless because a newer model exists. But I think there's a genuinely useful, practical shift available to you, and it echoes something we said in our episode on Fromm. The relationship doesn't need you to win the philosophical argument about which model is correct. It needs you to become bilingual. Being bilingual here means something specific. It means understanding that when your adult child expects an apology from you the way they'd expect one from a friend, they're not disrespecting your role. They're applying the only framework they were given, the one where respect is earned continuously rather than assumed by position. It means recognizing that offering that apology, even though it might feel foreign to the hierarchy you were raised inside, isn't a loss of authority. It's a translation, the same translation Joshua Coleman's research described in our episode on loyalty and freedom. Meeting your child in the framework that's actually legible to them, without requiring yourself to fully abandon everything you believe about respect and structure in the process. And it means something for how you think about your own hurt, too. Because I don't want this episode to just ask you to accommodate a new framework without acknowledging what's genuinely lost in the transition. Something real is being mourned here. A version of automatic deference, automatic role-based respect, that an entire generation was promised as the reward for eventually becoming a parent themselves. And that promise, through no fault of your own, simply isn't the currency your own children were raised to trade in. That's a legitimate loss. Alice Miller might say it's also, in a strange way, a kind of liberation. An end to a hierarchy that, even in its warmest forms, always carried some cost to the child underneath it. Both of those things can be true. The loss is real, and the shift, over the long run, may also be building something healthier than what came before it, even if it doesn't feel that way from inside the hurt of it right now. If tracing this history gave you a clearer map of where this particular ache actually comes from, not a character flaw in your child, not a failure in how you raise them, but a genuinely massive philosophical shift compressed into one generation's worth of living. That's exactly the kind of clarity this channel exists to offer. The third voice is here to keep tracing these threads with you. So if this helped, subscribe, because there's a lot more of this history, and this healing still ahead of us. Next time, we're going to look at the practical side of becoming bilingual between these two models. Specific language that lets you hold on to your own values while actually being heard inside your child's framework, instead of the two of you talking past each other in languages neither one fully speaks. That's next time, here on The Third Voice.